I never imagined I'd be sitting here flipping through old photographs, preparing for the funeral of a man I spent my whole life trying to understand. Richard was my stepfather, but he never felt like my father. He was a man of few words, a rigid backbone of rules, and a permanent frown etched onto his face. I was 9 years old when he married my mother, Sarah. I remember the wedding clearly, Mom radiant in her simple white dress, eyes shining with hope for a fresh start. Richard, on the other hand, dressed in a stiff black suit, looking more like he was heading to a courtroom than to a celebration. Even then, his demeanor was stern, detached. The memories flood back now as I sit in the house I've called home, for decades, yet never truly felt belonged to me. The silence of the house is heavy, pressing against me like a weight I can't shake off. Death has a strange way of forcing us to reflect on the things we had, the things we lost, and the things we never quite got. I glance at the framed pictures scattered before me. One catches my eye, a younger me, around 10 years old, standing beside Richard. His hand rests on my shoulder, but it feels more like an obligation than affection, a duty. If someone had told me that after all the years of feeling unwanted, overlooked, and second best, Richard would leave everything to me, in the end, I would have laughed in their face. But that's exactly what happened, and no one was more furious than my stepbrother, Michael. Richard was never cruel, not in the way you'd expect a wicked stepfather to be. He never hit me. He never yelled. But his silence, his indifference, it was just as cutting. Everything I did seemed wrong in his eyes. I didn't sit up straight. Enough. I didn't use the right fork at dinner. My grades were good, but not good enough. You need to work harder, Jake, he'd say, his voice always flat, emotionless. The world won't be kind to you. I spent years wondering if he simply didn't know how to love a child that wasn't his, or if he resented having to take on the role of a father figure at all. And then Michael was born. Everything changed. From the moment Michael came into this world, Richard transformed. He was no longer the strict, cold man I had known. He smiled. He laughed. He praised. Michael's first steps? A celebration? Michael's first words? A moment of pride. Michael's school achievements, no matter how small? A grand occasion. And then there was me. I watched from the sidelines as Richard became the father I had always longed for, but only to Michael. One birthday stands out in my memory. Michael was 8. I was 17. Richard rented out an entire arcade for his party, complete with decorations, cake, and a mountain of gifts. I thought back to my own birthdays, a quiet dinner, a small present, and Richard's usual nod of acknowledgement. I was invisible. By the time I turned 25, my mother was sick. It was the first time I saw Richard show any real vulnerability. Though he remained outwardly stoic, I caught glimpses of his true self when he thought no one was watching. I saw him adjust Mom's pillows with gentle hands. I saw him hold her hand when he thought she was asleep. I saw him wipe his eyes when he thought no one was looking. But Michael? Michael was nowhere to be found. He had left home years ago, married Emma in secret, and built a life of his own. The calls became fewer. The visits, almost non-existent. When Mom passed away, it felt like our family fell apart completely. Michael didn't even come to the funeral. It was just me and Richard now, 2 men living in the same house, bound not by love, but by obligation. Richard died at 65. A heart attack in the middle of the night. Just like that, he was gone. Michael returned, not as a grieving son, but as a man ready to claim what he believed was rightfully his. He pulled me aside after the funeral. His voice was calm, almost casual. "So, the house. I'll need you to leave by the end of the month." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What?" He sighed as if explaining something obvious. "It's mine, Jake. You didn't actually think he'd leave it to you, did you?" For a moment I felt like that 9-year-old boy again, desperate for acceptance, desperate to belong, but I wasn't a child anymore. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll be out." That night I started packing, and then the phone rang. Mr. Thompson, Richard's attorney, had something urgent to discuss. The next day I arrived at the house. Michael was already there, impatiently waiting. "Let's get this over with," he said. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and began reading. Richards, will states that all of his possessions, including the house and savings, are to be inherited by Jake. Silence. Michael's face turned red. "That's a mistake." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "It's not." Richard was very clear in his final wishes. And then he pulled out a letter. "To my sons, I know this decision may come as a shock. I've made many mistakes as a father, demanding too much from Jake, spoiling Michael too much. But I have learned something in my final years. Being a son is not about blood, but about character. Jake, you stayed. You cared for me when I no longer deserved it. You became the man I had always hoped to raise. That is why I leave everything to you." Michael stormed out without another word. I sat there, staring at the letter, tears blurring my vision. Richard had never said he was proud of me. Until now. I decided to keep the house. I started a scholarship fund in Richard's name, for kids like me who had to fight for every bit of recognition they got. And I finally let go of the resentment, the pain, the anger. Richard wasn't a perfect father, but in his own flawed way, he loved me. I never expected it. This is a new chapter in my life, and I am ready to face it, bearing with me the lessons of the past and hope for a better future that might ultimately be the best inheritance of all. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real life. Family is not just where we are born, but also the stories we share. If this touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life together,